Hey everybody, it's Johnny Two-Face here, back with another reaction video. This time I'm reacting to Frederick the Great, the Battle of Maxen, 1759 by House of History. Now, if you haven't seen my reaction to the other episodes in this series, I suggest you check them out before checking this one out. And the usual disclaimer when I react to anything historical, if I don't show so much what is considered a proper reaction, is probably obvious I don't know much about the subject at hand, and if I do know anything, I'll most likely pause the video to give my input, or ask any curious questions below, or add any comments that might relate. So, with that being said, the link to the original video will be in the description down below. Please go and subscribe to House of History, another great history channel here on YouTube that deserves more support. And I'm not going to ramble on for too much longer. Let's get this up on screen and see what happens. Oh yeah, for these.
On the early morning of November 20.
Sorry for pausing already, but I do love the little preview that you get at the beginning. And it gives you kind of give you a preview of what's coming up. Slightly off topic, if you can see this here, this village up here, Falkenhayn, isn't that named after a German general in World War One? Or has that always been like that? Or is that what the... Sorry, I'm getting myself muddled up here. Or is that what the famous German general in World War One was named after, the village of Falkenhayn? Just a random question.
20th, 1759.
Let's continue.
Prussian General Fink and his army camped around the village of Maxen.
At least it's an easier name to pronounce.
The king tasked
that was just redundant.
An important and crucial mission. He was to cut off the Austrian army from their supply lines.
Sounds like an ideal plan.
As dawn set in, several scouts rushed towards his quarters. Austrian troops were approaching from not one, not two, but three sides. They were surrounded. There was no...
That sounds like to me that the Austrians caught wind of their plans. Because how else would they rapidly advance against the Prussians at Maxen?
Way out. General Fink had no other option but to fight for survival.
Yep. The King of Prussia sells his defeats at a dear rate. Russian General Saltykov to Tsarina Elizabeth.
The Battle of Kunersdorf was the worst defeat of the Prussian army in 3 wars. Prussia's 48,000-strong army deteriorated into, at best, 3,000 soldiers resembling somewhat of a fighting force. There was no way the kingdom would survive this, as the Austrians, Russians, Imperials and Swedes had the perfect opportunity to converge against it. Exactly what Frederick the Great had feared all this time.
Yep.
In the battle's direct aftermath, Frederick was violently ill, exhausted, depressed, and contemplated suicide or abdication.
That is such great detail of how Frederick looked. And it just makes you wonder, how the hell is he going to get lucky and get out of this, or is luck finally up? We'll find out.
The kingdom was in dire straits, but despite their victory at Kunersdorf, the Russians also received an enormous blow. Their losses were not to be underestimated. Saltykov lost 4,700 men at the Battle of Kai, and another 19,000 at Kunersdorf. His army bore the absolute brunt of the damage. When General von Lauden urged Saltykov to launch a pursuit, the Russian general did not want to risk worsening the Pyrrhic victory. He did not pursue it, and neither did Lauden. The Prussian army, or what was left of it, was left alone. It led to a remarkable recovery. When the Prussians learned their enemies would not pursue them, everything was set in motion to recover from their losses. 2 weeks after the battle, Frederick wrote a letter to Prince Henry. I can announce to you the miracle of the House of Brandenburg.
So I don't need to pause here.
Just when the enemy had crossed the Oder and could have fought the war by risking a second battle, he marched in opposite direction. I marched first to cut him off from that part of Lusatia, which was being obliged to keep him supplied. Officers rounded up those who fled. Soldiers returned when they realized a counterattack was not imminent. General Fink levied the unscathed small Prussian army in Pomerania to march them towards Frederick's camp. By the end of August, his army numbered 33,000 soldiers. Frederick was aware he required more luck than he could realistically expect if he were to beat the Austrians. He calculated Daun commanded around 90,000.
Well, to think, before this, the Prussians were a thorn in the Austrians' side ever since the Frederick and the Prussian army took Silesia.
The quality of Prussian soldiers was nothing to write home about.
I fear my troops more than the enemy. Wow.
Many of them were freebooters and rogues. Frederick was unnerved and impatient, understandably so. Large armies surrounded his kingdom, and he was entirely in the dark about what plans its commanders had. In the east, Daun sent General Lacy to Saltykov to propose an attack against Berlin or seizing Silesia. Saltykov was wary, intending to retreat to his winter quarters. It wasn't until the interference of Vienna and St. Petersburg that Saltykov conceded. If Daun reinforced him, he agreed to march on Glogau. Frederick panicked. He had been shadowing Saltykov, and now he was at risk of facing an Austrian and Russian assault. He did not want to let the Russians seize Glogau, and despite being outnumbered, he resigned himself to defending it to the death. Around Saxony, combat began heating up.
Wow.
The Imperial Army under Prince von Zweibrücken captured Halle, Leipzig, and Wittenberg. They marched on Dresden. A ragtag bunch of corps battalions under Johann von Wunsch was sent to defend the city. Ferdinand, in the west, could spare no soldiers, but the old general managed to surprise his enemies and his king. His recapture of Wittenberg and Torgau was the first positive news that reached the king in a long while. This was fantastic news, be it not that Dresden's commander surrendered to the Imperials one day before news of Wunsch's approach reached him. Positive news followed. Daun failed to reinforce Saltykov with food and artillery. The Russian commander refused to lay siege to Glogau, and a stalemate developed. The Prussians and Russians faced each other, neither side engaging in combat. Frederick finished his monograph on King Charles XII during this period. Surprisingly, he had ample free time. Whereas the East was in a lull, action heated up around Saxony. Frederick ordered Henry and his 20,000 troops to join his generals there. The prince was reluctant, but once he went, he was unstoppable. His army marched 50 miles in 2 nights. At Hoyerswerda, he fought a corps of irregulars, capturing 1,800 prisoners, losing only 44 men.
Impressive.
Henry's advance caused Daun to hurry towards Dresden, reportedly in such a rush that he lost 3,000 soldiers underway due to exhaustion and desertion. In Saxony, a stalemate developed as well. Although Henry worried immensely about his chances against Daun, Frederick ordered him to shadow the Austrians. On October 15th, Saltykov finally broke the stalemate and began his long withdrawal to his winter quarters at Thorn, much to the anger of the Austrians. Loudon was forced to start the long march through Poland to Moravia for his winter quarters. This freed up all Prussian soldiers in the east. The anxious Henry would soon be reinforced as the king embarked on the trek westward. His confidence was returning.
General Fink has filled your mind with black thoughts. I beg you for the love of God to think definitely with more nerve. Frederick to Prince Henry. Wow.
Right before Frederick arrived, Henry defeated Arenberg, who tried to outflank him nearby Torgau. Surprisingly, and against all odds, things were looking up for the Prussians.
So far.
In early November, the brothers met at Torgau. United, their army numbered around 60,000. Again, quantity did not mean quality, but things were certainly recovering. Dresden was still in Austrian hands, but most of the electorate had been reconquered. Frankly, the situation for Prussia was better than expected. Daun refused to engage in battle. Instead, he waited for the Prussians to make a mistake while preparing his retreat. But Frederick wanted Daun out of Saxony on his terms, so he ordered General von Fink, together with 15,000 soldiers, to march south. At Maxen, south of Dresden, he had to cut off the Austrian supply lines, forcing their abandonment of Dresden.
You'll have there a very good position. And here we are.
On November 19th, Fink's army reached the village of Maxen. It was one of the first snowy days of the year. The village stood on a plateau surrounded by the Erzgebirge. Most pastures were frozen. He commanded around 4,000 cavalry and 11,000 infantry. Daun was onto the Prussians, and he knew that once part of the Prussian army was isolated, it was an easy target. He divided a 32,000
kind of divide and conquer
strong army into parts, all converging on Maxen from different sides. His army approached from the southwest and set up camp at Dippoldiswalde. An imperial army guarded the village of Dohna in the northeast, while General Anton Joseph von Brentano-Cimaroli approached from the northwest. Both commanders commanded 16,000 troops.
Sorry,
Fink
that was
outnumbered
irritating me.
at least 2-1. Fink deployed his army in a defensive crescent position on the hills around Maxen towards Schmorsdorf. He was well aware his enemies surrounded him, and he did his best to deploy his army strategically. Besides the central deployment, he deployed Wünsch's small corps between Falkenhayn and Sürsen. On the morning of November 20th, covered by fog, Daun's army departed from Dippoldiswalde, a 2-hour march away from Maxen. Among the commanders were Siskevich and Lacy. Cimaroli also embarked on a march. The Austrian armies converged on the small village and Fink's defensive positions. The frozen ground made moving difficult for artillery and cavalry. The first skirmishes erupted around Reinhardsgrimma, where Daun's vanguard expelled Prussian pickets. These retreated to Maxen, with Daun's army in pursuit. By late morning, Daun's infantry scaled the hills to Maxen's south and installed the first artillery pieces. These opened fire against Fink's left flank. Nearly an hour of an artillery duel followed. The high ground Daun occupied dominated most, if not all, withdrawal routes from the Prussian position. They were surrounded. There was no way out. After the initial artillery duel, Daun ordered his infantry to advance. 2 infantry columns charged ahead, with cavalry flanking each side. Combat erupted on the hills between Wittgensdorf and Maxen. Heavily outnumbered, the Prussians quickly gave way. Before too long, several Austrian battalions pushed into Maxen. This caused the Prussian left flank to be cut off from the remainder of their army, including the cavalry. These retreated behind Maxen because the horses were getting restless from the continued artillery bombardment. The attack had already been underway for a while when Cimaroli and his army arrived. Part of his army faced the Prussian right flank, and part of it lined up to flank them and attack their rear. Despite being outnumbered, Fink tried to prevent this from happening by taking the initiative. He ordered his cuirassiers to launch a charge against the Austrian position,
cuirassiers.
but the ground was frozen. The cavalry charge did not take up speed, and the Austrian volleys easily picked off the Prussians. When Cimaroli's artillery began firing grapeshot, the cavalry broke. It was a disaster, and his cavalry retreated. Fink spent considerable time rallying them. As this was ongoing, Daun linked up with Cimaroli. They launched a coordinated general attack against the Prussian center. Again heavily outnumbered, The infantry was easily overwhelmed. The vanguard retreated, leaving standards, flags, and artillery up for grabs. Some Prussian regiments tried to launch a counterattack. The Austrian cavalry was close enough to nip this in the bud, despite the rugged terrain. Dragoons launched a counteroffensive, routing the infantry. It was a disaster. Fink understood the severity of the situation. He rounded up whatever troops he could find and marched north towards Wunsch's contingent. But the Austrians were everywhere, and he didn't get further than Schmorsdorf. Many soldiers were left behind to be captured by the Austrians, as Fink haphazardly tried to get his army in battle position at Schmorsdorf. Meanwhile, in the background, a Reichsarmee contingent was advancing from Dohna, Burghardswalde, and Wiesenstein. Combat continued, but the remaining Prussians managed to keep the advancing Austrians and Reichsarmee back for now. Because it was a short November day, night fell early. Under cover of darkness, Fink's army retreated towards Falkenhayn. Here, they linked up with Wunsch's corps, which had been stationed there since the beginning. As they left Schmorsdorf, the Austrians immediately seized the village. The Reichsarmee contingents kept a close eye on their every movement. Fink tried to get his cavalry to find an escape route. He was informed there was none, and he could do nothing but request a surrender to Daun. The Austrian commander told him he would only accept a surrender if this included the cavalry and Wunsch's corps. Seeing no reasonable way out, Fink conceded. Fink was surrounded, cut off, and forced to capitulate. As a result, 2,000 Prussians became a casualty and 13,000 were captured. 16 battalions, 36 squadrons. Among them were 9 generals, 500 officers, and 71 artillery pieces, 44 ammunition wagons, and 96 flags. Besides Kunersdorf, this was one of the most significant numerical losses Prussia suffered during the war. Daun lost 934 soldiers, including dead and wounded. The losses at Maxen were significant. Daun simply used his overwhelming numbers to storm the Prussian positions and seize a relatively easy victory. Frederick blamed Fink for the disaster, despite the general following his orders. The general spent the remainder of the war in Austrian captivity, and upon his return, Frederick had him court-martialed and imprisoned. Even the king's most loyal supporters had to admit Fink was just following orders, and if anything, the operation was Frederick's personal failing. Things snowballed in the aftermath. 2 weeks after Maxen, a Prussian force was defeated and captured at Meissen. Another 3,500 soldiers were lost. It was an embarrassing affair. Because the Austrians knew of their numerical superiority, they refused all prisoner exchanges. This was an enormous problem for Prussia. They were indeed very short on manpower. But as became customary, Daun remained cautious. He returned to his winter quarters in Dresden and did not engage the Prussians for the remainder of winter. That is how the 1759 campaign ended.
Badly.
Prussia had lost most engagements since Hochberg the year before. It was a year of bloody defeats, some surprising reverses, but ultimately the Prussians drew the shortest end of the stick. The shortages in manpower, finances, and ammunition wore down the army, and the king personally. He struggled with his health. He was rarely healthy, had constant bouts of gout and fever. He barely slept. As the first snow fell, it appeared that his kingdom's future was one of imminent defeat and partition. Thank you very much for watching this video. If there is a topic, battle, or person you would like to know more about, let me know your thoughts in a comment. I would also like to thank all my...
And that'll do it. This has been another interesting video, and yeah, like the narrator just said, just seems to be a lot of defeats for Prussia, so it wouldn't surprise me if the Austrians somehow took back Silesia, but we'd have to wait and see. So anyway, if you like this reaction, please like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.